Late at night on November the 16th in 2009, a pre-trial detention inmate, the 37-year-old Sergei Magnitsky, was found dead in a cell of the Matroska Tishina prison in Moscow. Hours later, the world heard a story. Police jailed, tortured, and murdered a hero whistleblower who'd accused them of stealing $230 million. That story deeply shocked me, and I knew one day I'd make a movie about it. It's while making that film that I started to doubt whether the crime had actually been solved. Putting my film together, I ended up putting together pieces of that big crime. It is that story that I need to tell now. So I go back to where it started, on a wet and cold November night, when I first heard of Magnitsky, and of a man who'd actually broken the story to the world, Magnitsky's fund manager boss, Bill Browder.
It is a tale of intrigue and multi-million-dollar corruption which led to the mysterious death of a lawyer in a Russian jail 2 nights ago. Sergei Magnitsky was working for William Browder, the London-based investor wanted by Moscow for alleged tax evasion. Do you think your lawyer has been effectively killed?
It's quite clear. He testified against certain Interior Ministry officers, and the same officer arrested him, stuck him in jail, and then 2 nights ago he died.
Bill, you also have a horrific part of this story with a lawyer that you hired who you say was taken by police, jailed, and tortured to death.
He very bravely testified against the police officers who had been involved in this big crime.
He had the audacity to testify against the police in Russia.
Wow. And the Russian Interior Ministry asked Interpol to put you on their wanted list, correct?
Well, Russia's one of the only countries where they make announcements like that aren't true. Interpol won't listen to their request because it's a corrupt and politically motivated request.
So I was on the Interpol wanted list for fighting for justice for my murdered lawyer.
Having managed the biggest Western hedge fund in Russia, Bill Browder turned into one of the biggest defenders of human rights in my country. So it wasn't surprising Russia wanted to have him arrested.
Sergei Magnitsky was 36 at the time. I got the news of his murder on the 17th of November 2009, and I made a vow to myself, to his memory and to his family, that I was going to make sure that the people who did this face justice.
Fighting for the memory of Magnitsky, the hero of my future film, Browder stood up to some very dangerous people, and so he himself was a hero in my eyes.
Just want to thank you for this commitment and passion pursuing justice for your colleague and for all of us. So thank you very much, Bill Browder.
Thank you.
Bill Browder and I had a common cause, telling the world about the hero Magnitsky, and we had a common enemy. The Russian regime was after him. The Russian regime had been after my friends and myself. I made a film about a KGB defector, Litvinenko, poisoned in London. After Litvinenko, a film on Magnitsky was a very logical step for me. Finding the right actor to play Magnitsky was a challenge. I didn't have much to go by reconstructing Sergei's character. He was simply the most courageous person Bill Browder said he'd ever met, a hero of our time. I'd snatch every moment of Bill's time I possibly could to consult him on the details of the story I'd based my film on. A natural storyteller, Bill was making the plot of a complex crime sound straightforward and shooting ready. Can I just explain to you what we're trying to do with our film? Even though you made the story very, very well known, but as you know, the world is big.
Anything that can be done to make it more well known is of huge interest to our campaign.
Exactly, and we don't ask you to write a script for us. We don't ask you to direct a movie, but we want maybe to use you to tell the story.
I mean, I've told the story.
Yeah.
Yes. By me telling the story in 10-minute testimonies, it's created laws, it's created major international investigations, it's created huge repercussions with the Russian government. The story itself is horribly shocking.
Six months later, most of the material for my docudrama had been shot and roughly edited. I followed Bill Browder's story as closely as possible.
He wasn't a guy who was an opposition politician or a human rights activist. He was a lawyer. He bought his Starbucks in the morning and went and worked in his cubicle. He wasn't inviting trouble. He wasn't asking for anything other than to live a normal life in Russia. And Sergei, when he was put to the ultimate test, he became the ultimate hero. Russia is totally a lawless place. There was a guy named Major Pavel Karpov. He's on a salary of $6,000 a year. The police, they steal the money. And what do they like to do with their money? They like to compete with each other to be more luxurious than the next guy.
Здравствуйте, как залетели? Спасибо вам, что приехали. Очень приятно. Как супруга? Как дела? Все хорошо. Сейчас я вас познакомлю с таким человеком.
Russia had made this grand decision to go from communism to capitalism. There were actually lots of opportunities to make money investing in the shares. And so I moved to Moscow in 1996 with great hopes and great dreams that Russia was really going to be going through a transformation from a very backward place to a westernized European democracy. So I started my business in 1996. I started a fund called the Hermitage Fund and I become the largest foreign investor in the country. I had $4.5 billion invested in Russia. And it all went very, very well until
Кто вы такие?
Сантехники, у вас трубы прорвало. Давай, пошли. Порвите его.
Где документы компании?
Уставные документы где?
The police raided my office in Moscow. And the basic objective of their search was to take away all of the stamps and seals and corporate documents that belonged to the three companies through which we had made all of our investments in Russia.
В общем, на счетах Браудера ничего нет. Все деньги он вывел за границу.
Сколько господин Браудер заплатил налогов в прошлом году?
$200 000. Нет, $250 США.
Ради этого стоит помараться.
Что вы предлагаете?
Оставьте дела профессионалам.
А мы типа лузеры, да? Ну что, я не видел никогда, как налоги возвращают, что ли?
Подготовьте оригиналы уставных документов предприятия и печати.
Что кроме документов и печати вам необходимо?
Пока что это все. Список лиц, услуги которых надо будет оплатить. Предупреждаю, коротким он не будет. Вот и ладненько.
We didn't understand what they needed because we didn't have any assets left in Russia. We sold more than $4 billion worth of stock in 2006. So we immediately went through our list of lawyers in Moscow and called up the smartest lawyer we knew, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky.
Oh, yes. Yes. I call you tomorrow, Bill. Okay? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Bill. Goodbye.
Что-то случилось?
Иди спать, Наташа. Иди спать. Что-то нехорошее случилось с компаниями Билла Браудера.
А нельзя это решить завтра? В рабочее время?
В рабочее время. В рабочее время у меня есть основная работа. А Билл Браудер, ты же знаешь, шеф фонда «Эрмитаж», нашел меня и нанял выяснить, что происходит с его фирмами. Ты, говорит, лучший юрист в Москве по этим вопросам.
If there was one person who knew the law backwards and forwards, up and down, it was Sergei Magnitsky. And he comes back and he says, the situation is actually not a mistake at all. In fact, it's far worse than I could have ever imagined. After the police raided your offices and took all those papers and seals and documents, they used them to re-register your companies so you no longer own them. Your companies have been stolen from you.
Ну что ж, предприятия переоформлены. Поздравляю вас с назначением председателем совета директоров.
Да.
Как наш банкир, выручаетесь за сохранность средств, посланных на счета в вашем банке. Когда поступят деньги, до момента официального зачисления на счет, вы сообщаете мне лично.
But Sergei didn't stop his investigation. He carried on. And he discovered something very interesting in his investigation, which was that after our companies had been stolen, the registered owner of our stolen company went to 2 obscure banks and opened bank accounts. And once he discovered these banks, he then started to pull on the string of this discovery. And then he discovered that immediately after they opened the accounts at these banks, there was this enormous spike in deposits from $1 million to $230 million. And this enormous spike in deposits was exactly equal to the amount of taxes that we had paid. So we said to ourselves, and Sergei said to himself, is it possible that the police stole our companies to steal the taxes that we paid to the government? So they weren't stealing from us. The police were stealing from their own government. And so we started to do more checks, and that's exactly what happened. The police, together with organized criminals, stole $230 million from their own government.
Юзефа! Юзефа!
А что, это колодец? А что?
А мы накрыли лист бумаги, накрывает колодец. Папа, ты проиграл.
Я пойду пройдусь на озеро.
Я с тобой.
Билл Браудер предлагает нам уехать.
Почему?
Все очень серьезно. Преступники украли не только компании Браудера, но и $250 миллиарда, которые Браудер заплатил налоговикам в предыдущем году.
Ты это все раскопал. Значит, мы должны уехать.
Почему мы должны уезжать? Почему мы должны лишаться всего? Бросать родину?
Но у тебя есть дети, Сереж.
Ты же ведь не хочешь уезжать?
Sergey was working together with a team of lawyers from 4 different law firms. I went to all the lawyers and I said, guys, it's too dangerous to stay in Russia. Get you out. 6 of the lawyers eventually agreed to leave. But the one guy who wouldn't leave was Sergey. In October of 2008, Sergey testified at the Russian State Investigative Committee about the involvement of the 2 police officers who raided the offices and transferred the documents to the criminals.
Добрый день.
Добрый день.
Я бы хотел заявить о преступлении. В офисе моего клиента Билла Браудера нагрянула милиция с целью конфисковать учредительные документы и печати компании. Командовали рейдом офицеры Карпов и Кузнецов. С помощью конфискованных документов они перерегистрировали компании Браудера на подставных владельцев. Эти владельцы заявили в налоговой, что у них многомиллионные долги. Потребовали вернуть им те налоги, которые Браудер уплатил еще в предыдущем году. Налоговая, вероятно, в сговоре с преступниками выплатила всю сумму уплаченных Браудером налогов. А это 230 миллионов долларов. Вот схема.
Sergey said, the police, together with organized criminals, stole $230 million from my country, and I'm going to make sure that they're brought to justice. In any country in the world, if you had disclosed a $230 million theft from the government, the entire system would lock down, find the people who stole the money, find the money, and put everybody in jail. But that's not what happened here.
Не трогайте там личные вещи.
Вещдоки.
1 month after Sergei testified against those officers, 3 officers who reported directly to one of the officers he testified against came to his house at 8 in the morning in front of his wife and 2 children and arrested him.
Пап, ты на работу? Ты честно на работу?
Сынок, я скоро вернусь. Скоро вернусь. Наташа, не надо. Я вернусь.
Мам, не плачь. Пожалуйста.
Хватай картишки.
Давай 6.
Посмотрим, как ты там
They put him in pretrial detention, very specifically to get him to withdraw his testimony against the officers. To do that, they started to torture him. They put him into a cell with 8 inmates and 4 beds, so nobody could sleep. They had to fight over the beds and sleep in shifts.
Все, Фрай, обломался. Спит.
Юрист! Подъем! Хватит дрых! Смена! Вставай быстрее! Давай, вставай, бегом!
Давай туда дальше. Может, давай юриста обращаться? Сейчас должен этот еще быть наблюдатель, кто там, блядь.
The one thing that was very interesting about Sergei was that he was the lawyer's lawyer. Every single thing that happened to him, he wrote a complaint about. In his 358 days in detention, he wrote 450 complaints.
Юрист! Жалобу начальству катаешь!
Меня кипятильник отобрали.
Меня кипятильник отобрали! Ты не понял, куда ты попал? А ну покажи маляву свою, которую тут катаешь!
They were so arrogant, the people who were torturing him, they just thought, we'll just ignore his complaints. What they didn't understand was that every complaint that he sent to them, one went to his lawyer and a copy went to us. And so all the way through this, we were able to track how they were doing, what they were doing to him, and how they were essentially trying to break him and ruin his life. They transferred him to a cell without a toilet, just a hole in the floor. And oftentimes the sewage would bubble up onto the floor, and they couldn't even stand on the floor without stepping in sewage.
Вот дерьмо собачье! Затухай, забей! Затухай! Затухай!
Магнитский, вы же умный человек. Вы знаете, почему вы здесь, и знаете, что надо сделать, чтобы вас здесь не было.
Я этого не знаю. Я знаю одно, что я не нарушал законов. Потому что я знаю закон.
Сергей?
Подпишите дело с концом. Тут нет ничего такого. Вы никого не предаете, вы Просто признайте, что немного погорячились.
Все с нами. Что вы там?
Ничего не крали, никаких налогов, ни из какой казны. Один ваш автограф, и вы едете домой. К супруге, к деткам.
Я слышал, там у вас проблемы в камере с канализацией. Мы же не можем допустить, чтобы подследственный захлебнулся в камере в собственном дерьме, правильно? Поэтому мы пошли вам на уступки. Мы переведем вас в другую камеру. Правда, там есть маленькая проблема. Там нет окна. Не, ну как? Окно-то есть, но там нет стекла. Я слышал, вы жаловались на несвежий воздух. Теперь эта проблема будет решена.
Кажется, я ошибался. Магнитский не такой умный человек, как им казалось. Я понял, кто он. Магнитский герой. Да. Я не герой.
Я знаю, вы держите меня здесь, потому что я обнаружил хищение из казны на $250 миллиарда. И что я доказал, что это сделали вы. Вы обокрали самых уязвимых людей, которые, проработав всю жизнь, получают $200 в месяц. Вы обокрали больных людей, которые умрут, потому что денег на их лечение нет, которые им полагается бесплатно по закону. Потому что $250 миллиарда налоговых денег, которые эти капиталисты заплатили, пошли на ваши развлечения, на ваши яхты, на ваши виллы, на ваших девок!
Молчать! Крыса ты бухгалтерская! Сержант!
They then transferred him to a cell without any window panes in December in Moscow. All throughout this time, they were doing everything possible to try to break him. But no matter what, he would not withdraw his testimony. You only know what a person is made of when they're tested like that. And Sergei, when he was put to the ultimate test, he became the ultimate hero. After 5 months of this unhealthy, not sleeping, cold sewage, he started experiencing very extreme pains in his stomach. And they diagnosed him as having pancreatitis and gallstones. And they denied him all medical attention from then on.
Врача! 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 Слушайте, врача!
Так рано же еще.
Everybody is involved. There's all one big mutually beneficial system of corruption. They declared that Sergei Magnitsky died of natural causes.
Напишешь «Острое сердечко».
139 million good-hearted, generous, emotionally connected people in Russia who are living in an occupied country by 1 million law enforcement criminals. Sergei Magnitsky exposed Karpov, and nothing has happened. The guys who he testified against have been promoted from the Moscow Interior Ministry to the Federal Interior Ministry. He went into critical condition on the night of November 16th. He was yelling that someone was trying to kill him. They put him in an isolation cell for 1 hour and 18 minutes with a doctor outside the door until he died. He was 37 years old. He went into prison healthy. He went into prison as a normal, middle-class tax lawyer. He got plucked out of a regular life, put into the most grueling, torturous, horrible, medieval situation, and tortured over a long period of time until he died.
We stopped the camera.
I didn't know how the film should end. I rewrote my script many times, as there were different versions of Magnitsky's death.
The story that I want to tell you is about Sergei Magnitsky, who was my lawyer, who died in horrific circumstances in Russian state custody. They put him in an isolation cell, chained him to a bed, and allowed 8 riot guards with rubber batons to beat him for 1 hour and 18 minutes until he died.
Scene 6, let's see, take 1.
Порвите его!
In reenacting this violent version of Magnitsky's death, I couldn't fit 8 or even 7 riot guards in a space equivalent to Magnitsky's prison cell. But trying to be truthful to the facts, I was looking into the evidence that the man had actually been beaten. Bill Browder had published photographs of the traces of a beating. As we were working on the makeup, I was thinking that the traces could also have been left by handcuffs. Russian officials admitted they'd briefly handcuffed Magnitsky because he was behaving erratically and could have harmed himself. That was registered in a report. With skepticism, I was listening to officials' comments on the forensic examination of Magnitsky.
Причина смерти – острая сердечно-сосудистая недостаточность. Безусловно, там тоже, не буду скрывать, есть в судебно-медицинской экспертизе факты того, что на его теле следы повреждений присутствуют на ногах и на руках от наручников. Но, опять же, результатами судебно-медицинской экспертизы установлено и четко все сфиксировано, что причинно-следственной связи между этими повреждениями и смертью нет.
Владимирович, надо еще уточнить, дабы не поняли превратно, вот сам факт избиений, таких фактов не установлено.
Apart from the abrasions on the wrists, which the police said resulted from Magnitsky's being handcuffed, I found a relevant statement from Magnitsky's lawyer, Kharitonov.
На костяшках пальцев, Сережа, на обеих руках очень большие ссадины гематомы. То есть я так думаю, что он просто-напросто калашматил в дверь со страшной силой, чтобы его вывели, но никто, видимо, не прилетел.
So there were some disagreements about what caused the bruises. But I also started to wonder about the logic behind so many riot guards spending 1 hour and 18 minutes beating a handcuffed prisoner.
По факту этого человека были наручники. С другой стороны, говорят, что его забили 7 насмерть. Вот если человек буянит, да, и у вас есть возможность его так, значит, ну, не всегда законно, но мы российскую, в принципе, и путинскую, да, и как бы брутальную. Но они бы одевали ему наручники или они просто
Они бы
забили?
просто его забили.
Да?
В таком количестве...
Человек перестает буянить после первых таких 3 ударов.
Без всяких наручников.
Без всяких наручников.
Он
уже спокойно себе лежит, да, и ему больше ничего не надо.
And where does this information that there were 7 riot guards come from?
There was a Russian source, there's the presidential human rights council.
A human rights investigation of the circumstances of Magnitsky's death was widely reported in Russia. Main state-controlled channels ran a rather detailed, neutral coverage of the report, presenting it as detailed and thorough.
Члены президентского совета по правам человека сегодня обнародовали новые данные по резонансному делу Сергея Магнитского.
По мнению членов совета, Магнитский мог погибнуть в результате избиения.
На снимках, которые правозащитники приложили к более чем 100-страничному докладу, видны следы, похоже, не только наручников.
Вот. Ну неужели вот эти раны могли возникнуть просто от того? Смотрите, какие глубокие. Вот. Смотрите, как совершенно очевидно.
But the 100-page document Mr. Borshov, the head of the committee, was holding was not a Russian report. It looked like a PowerPoint presentation from Mr. Browder's website. Was there anything wrong with Russian human rights activists somehow cooperating with Bill Browder on the investigation of the Magnitsky case? Probably not, I was saying to myself. No one was denying Browder had been lobbying the Magnitsky case in Washington, very successfully too.
Russia doesn't function as a normal state as we know it.
2 laws were passed in America known as the Magnitsky Acts. They created a mechanism for punishing Russians and other non-Americans.
We've now reached another milestone for Sergei Magnitsky. It is clear that those who are gross violators of human rights, that they're not going to be able to travel to the United States or use our banking system. The legislation sets a precedent for international conduct that we expect will be honored globally.
President Obama signed the first Magnitsky Act in December 2012. In its justification part, the law cited a Russian human rights report as the source of information about Magnitsky beaten by 8 guards with rubber batons. That was indeed claimed in the report Russian activists presented in 2011. But did it matter that the report, a US law called Russian and independent, was in reality Mr. Browder's presentation?
Смотрите, как совершенно очевидно.
So how did Sergei Magnitsky die, and who was to blame? I wanted to talk to his mother about it, at the risk of perhaps provoking painful memories. Natalia Magnitskaya kindly agreed to meet me in Bill Browder's London office.
А вот можно все-таки назвать имена людей, которые вот виноваты в смерти Сергея?
Конкретное лицо, которое больше всех виновато, это, я считаю, это Гаусс.
так сказать. Да. Рядом с Сергеем никого не было. Они его там заперли и все. Хотя вот по всем инструкциям, если у человека там какой-то психоз, то рядом с ним обязательно должен находиться, ну, если не санитар, то хотя бы какой-то надзиратель, мало ли что человек с собой там может сделать, может ему там плохо стоит. То есть она никакой помощи ему не оказала.
Но вопрос это избиение не расследуется, он просто повис.
Да, там было, значит, сначала был документ, что были применены наручники и дубинки, а потом, значит, потом сказали, что дубинки не были применены. Это ошибочно бланк написали, что дубинки, это просто 2 раза про наручники должно было быть написано. Несколько было проведено медицинских экспертиз. Сначала дилатационная кардиомиопатия, потом уже стали говорить какая-то другая, вот именно что кардиомиопатия, а она развилась на фоне сахарного диабета.
Экспертиза?
Да.
А и панкреатита там нет?
Нет, панкреатит есть, но там нет такой, как сказать, это не причина смерти. Это не причина смерти. Избиение тоже не причина смерти. Причиной смерти они выводят, что все-таки сердечный приступ.
Доверять это? Это какая-то...
Ну, как сказать, может быть и сердечный приступ, но до этого сердечного приступа, значит, его довели.
Вот, конечно, вопрос возникает, можно это назвать намеренным, что вот это все было сделано намеренно? Или это вот наша российская какая-то...
Халатность. Знаете, трудно сказать, было ли это намерение убить его, но, может быть, это было... Ну, естественно, это не просто так его туда-сюда перебрасывали. Может быть, они хотели, чтобы он оговорил себя, оговорил Билла. Вот этого они добивались. Добивались ли они его смерти, я не могу сказать. Мне было бы так думать еще тяжелее, чем то, что он умер все-таки от болезни, а не то, что его там убили. Это еще страшнее. Вот так.
I was perplexed. Natalia's account of her son's death was very different from Browder's. She blamed doctors' negligence, not a beating by the police, for Sergei's death. That didn't make me rethink the role of the police in the scam. But there was another thing I found somewhat surprising. Pavel Karpov, the main villain in our film, accused of torturing and killing Magnitsky, took Browder to court for libel in London. Unexpectedly for me, Judge Simon made certain statements in Karpov's favor, but the case was then nevertheless dismissed, as Karpov was deemed to have no connection to the UK and no reputation there to defend.
Okay.
So you must be happy about the judgment.
Well, this was a real vindication for justice for Sergei Magnitsky campaign. These people tried to shut us up. They tried to stifle our freedom of expression, and the judge made an unprecedented ruling, which is that libel tourists should be thrown out of England.
Why do you think Karpov risked coming to London and exposing himself like this, and where everything can be considered? This is not Moscow, you know.
Well, I think he expected that the UK libel laws were so antiquated that a criminal could come and somehow stifle free speech using these old libel laws, and today's judgment will be precedent-setting.
Have you met Karpov, or do you know?
I've never met the guy in my life. We learned that Karpov became rich from this crime, and we publicized his role, which has led to him being sanctioned by the United States government. And then he had the audacity to come here and sue us, paying high-priced libel lawyers to come and terrorize us in the UK. And thank God the judge ruled in our favor.
Okay, but I just spoke to Karpov's lawyer. They gave me this press release that say that there was some kind of measure of vindication for Karpov. Can you comment on that?
There's some nonsense technicality. Basically, they won that Karpov wasn't in the room. He wasn't one of the 7 riot guards who beat Sergei Magnitsky to death. But the judge actually encouraged us to refile our application if we ever had to say that Karpov was a member of a criminal group that did this. And there was no vindication for them whatsoever as far as we're concerned.
7 riot guards
beat Magnitsky to death, but Karpov wasn't in the room. I was surprised not to find or recall the judge encouraging Mr. Browder to refile an application against Karpov. The judge actually said something rather different. Nothing in this judgment is intended to suggest that if the defendants, Browder, were to continue to publish unjustified defamatory material about the claimant, Karpov, the court would be powerless to act. Karpov was the main bad guy in my film. Him going out of his way to protest his innocence in a Western court seemed somewhat out of character to me. In Bill Browder's story, Karpov's alleged assets of over $1 million is a proof he'd committed the crime and got rich. The larger part of Karpov's assets was his flat. Moscow's real estate was one of the most expensive in the world before the 2008 crisis. A lot of Muscovites were millionaires by virtue of having owned a property in central Moscow since the communist days. Karpov is a Muscovite, but he bought the flat in question after the $230 million fraud, according to Browder. Somewhat surprisingly for me, Karpov agreed to meet and present his explanations.
Мы вышли на Карпова. Захотел встретиться со мной, да, реально Карпов. Вот. Уже тот факт, что он захотел говорить со мной, я просто хочу, чтобы на него посмотрел.
С удовольствием, конечно.
Благодарю.
Так, микрофон пойман.
Павел, это наш артист. Вы его прототип, а он, соответственно, вы. Если верить рассказам господина Браудера, мы сейчас сидим, разговариваем с убийцей. Вот мой актер пришел, что убийца.
По поводу убийства. Хорошая, красивая страшилка. Да, честно, даже, вот, может быть, в один там момент даже поверил вообще, что все это правда.
Вы поверили, что...
Ну, это я, да,
вы
это,
сами,
да, что я сам убил, да. Зачем убивать человека? Магнитский дал показания против меня. Да, что якобы я там принимал участие. Я не видел ни одного документа, подписанного Магнитским, где он делает прямое обвинение меня как лица, совершившего значит, мошенничество, хищение 3 компаний, а также похищение $230 миллионов из бюджета Российской Федерации. Браудер утверждает, что он нанял человека, значит, юриста для расследования этого дела. Да, вот он расследовал что-то, значит, дал показания на нас, потом его закрыли и так далее. То есть крайне нелогично. Нет никаких показаний в отношении меня. То есть их история начинается уже рушиться именно с этого момента. Что касается информации в отношении меня, информация о суммах и там каких-то квартирах, да, то очень много наврано, переврано, как утверждает Браудер. Квартира была приобретена вот именно после хищения денег из бюджета. Это свидетельство на квартиру. Квартира была приобретена там за несколько этапов, там 4-5 год. Так как это был новый дом и покупался мной на стадии фундамента, то, естественно, пока он, значит, был введен в эксплуатацию, пока начали выдавать эти свидетельства, очередь до выдачи мне свидетельства дошла в 2008 году. 4-5 год договора уступки. В 2004 году она не могла стоить $930 тысяч. Квартиру, кстати, я продал для того, чтобы рассчитаться с задолженностью по английскому процессу. Так что этой квартиры у меня уже нет. Да? Честь, она иногда стоит дорого. Давайте начнем с того, что, правда, меня обвиняют, что имеющиеся у меня документы были там мною использованы, либо кому-то переданы для перерегистрации компании. Если лицо является мошенником, то оригиналы не нужны просто по определению. Если кто-то их делал, совершал какие-то преступления, то это тихо, хитрым обманным путем найти документы любой организации не составляет никакого труда, и более, скажем так, неумного сценария в этом плане, да, что, значит, вот какие умные сотрудники полиции, милиции на тот момент, значит, организовали рейд, возбудили аж целое дело, пришли, то есть для того, чтобы вот именно изъять вот эти, значит, документы по этим 3 компаниям, ну, это придумать надо было, ну, не знаю, ну, наверное, для Голливуда.
Понял. Зачем же Браудер так сказать, вот, ополчился на вас?
Почему я, как утверждает Браудер, что история началась с рейда?
Да.
История началась намного раньше, в 2004 году, с момента возбуждения в отношении Браудера уголовного дела. В моем производстве находилось уголовное дело в отношении компании «Камея». Да, это были связаны налоговые претензии. То есть как только возбудили дело «Камея», сразу началась кампания. Вот инвестора из Европы ущемляют, прищемляют. А Браудер так на секундочку все это время зарабатывал миллионы, миллиарды, при этом забывая сказать о том, что и как ты делал на территории данного государства. Проще кричать, что вот, так сказать, я такой бедный, несчастный. Он находится в розыске. Европа его не ищет, насколько я знаю, Интерпол. Он везде кричит, что это политика. Браудер и компания лгут откровенно, везде и всюду. Он спокойно открывает ногой там двери там, парламентов, сенатов и так далее. И пока все верят ему.
I knew people were curious about Karpov's alleged fortune. He looked pretty dapper, but I didn't see any proof he'd benefited from the infamous $230 million fraud. Bill Browder had clearly got some things wrong. The date of the actual purchase of an off-plan property and the issuing of registration documents. Other property allegedly bought with the fraud money, but in reality acquired before the fraud, like 2 small plots of land and a car bought in 2006 on a loan. And Browder's quote of Karpov's salary was off the mark. Karpov's declared income was $6,000 a month, not in a year, as Browder had claimed. Was all that, all these striking images of Kopp's alleged possessions, a result of innocent oversight, exaggeration, or prejudice, or something else? What stuck in my mind was Karpov's claim that Magnitzki had never accused him of the infamous fraud. May that be true?
So in October of 2008, Sergei testified at the Russian State Investigative Committee about the involvement of the 2 police officers who raided the offices and transferred the documents to the criminals.
Magnitsky's accusation of Karpov is the fundamental premise of Bill Browder's story.
They put him in pretrial detention, very specifically to get him to withdraw his testimony against the officers.
Then I recalled being briefly puzzled by something while shooting the scene of Magnitsky testifying against Karpov and his fellow policemen. I was surprised by this document, the actual transcript of the testimony. It had been referred to by Bill Browder, the media and politicians as a bold and detailed incrimination of the police, a result of Magnitsky's thorough private investigation. But the scan of the transcript my production designer had downloaded looked like an examination of Magnitsky as a witness in a criminal police probe. That impression didn't fit the story I was filming, and I somehow ignored it. But having heard Karpov denying that Magnitsky had accused him, I looked up Magnitsky's testimony again. Amazingly, what was described in an English outline as Magnitsky's testimony against Karpov and Kuznetsov did not, in the Russian original, contain any accusations or evidence against the officers, not even their names. Why was the English outline of the Russian original so inaccurate? And why did Bill Browder insist Magnitsky had accused Karpov? I tried to reach Bill, first on the mobile, then via his office.
Is there any chance to get an hour, half an hour Bill's time, please?
Then by email. I wondered whether this reluctance to keep in touch was thanks to the kind of questions I'd asked Magnitsky's mother. In the meantime, the international campaign against those called the killers of the whistleblower Sergei Magnitsky was gaining pace. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe commissioned and debated the most in-depth investigation into the Magnitsky affair.
Die nächste Rednerin ist Frau Beck. Sie haben das Wort.
Magnitsky war ein Whistleblower. Ein Mann, der an sein Land glaubt, der nicht glauben kann, dass es in seinem Land möglich ist, dass Steuerbeamte, dass Beamte aus einem Innenministerium, gedeckt durch die Justiz, den Staat bestehlen können und das anzeigt, dieser Mann findet sich in Untersuchungshaft wieder. Das ist eine Geschichte, die so atemberaubend ist, eine albtraumartige Geschichte.
Marie-Louise Beck, a German Bundestag member I respected for straight-talking on human rights in Russia, seemed the right person to ask the questions that were starting to trouble me.
Marie Beck,
ja,
nice to meet you. Hello.
Also, danke, dass Sie Zeit gefunden haben.
Kann man sich mal vorstellen, Frau Sanikova Frank.
Ja. Guten Tag.
Hat in 10 Jahren in der russischen Menschenrechtsarbeit gearbeitet und meine Kenntnisse beruhen sehr stark auf Mascha. I might need her.
Absolutely.
Because she has been working on the case together with me. Okay.
Frau Beck, die Magnitsky-Geschichte, es geht um eine Person. Und gleichzeitig ist es so groß geworden. Warum ist die Geschichte eines Todes im Moskau-Gefängnis so berühmt und politisch wichtig geworden?
Die Tatsache, dass dieser Fall als Einzelfall aufgenommen worden ist, hat meines Erachtens etwas damit zu tun, dass bei Sergei Magnitsky wir es mit einem russischen Patrioten, würde ich sagen, zu tun hatten, der fest an die Kraft des Rechtsstaats geglaubt hat. Und damit ist er in einer Weise selber wenn man so will, eine rechtsstaatliche und demokratische Lichtgestalt gewesen. Das ist für mich die Erklärung Nummer 1. Die Erklärung Nummer 2 ist, dass mit Bill Browder ein Mann, der selber viele Möglichkeiten zur Verfügung hat, auch die Möglichkeiten, Zugang zu bekommen zu Parlamentariern, zu Regierungen, zu Medien, und der es, wenn ich es richtig einschätze, fast zu seiner Lebensaufgabe gemacht hat, den Fall Sergei Magnitsky nicht ruhen zu lassen.
Also es gibt einige Widersprüche in der sozusagen westlichen Version und die russische Version. Um kurz zu sagen, dieser Offizier, Pavel Karpov, der war bereit, mit mir zu reden. Er bat um eine Separation. Bitte unterscheiden Sie das Problem dieses Strafvollzugsystems und einige Tatsachen der Untersuchung. Ich sage nur
das ist mir jetzt zu unkonkret. Es gibt einen Anwalt, der eine Anklage erhebt. Dann wird er von eben den Personen, die von der Anklage betroffen gewesen wären, selber angeklagt. Hat nicht der Staat sagen?
Er wurde als Zeuge befragt, soweit ich weiß.
Ja, als Zeuge befragt.
Er wurde als Zeuge befragt und der hat etwas Amtsträger vorgeworfen.
Und dann gibt es einen Haftbefehl gegen ihn.
Ja,
und dann
absolut.
ist er
Nein.
11 Monate in Haft.
Nein, absolut.
Gut, also insofern brauchen wir das andere doch gar nicht zu diskutieren.
Nein, das Problem war, er hat keine Beschuldigung gemacht. Als in diesem Testimony, в этом протоколе не содержится никакого обвинения. Он был действительно допрошен, но обвинений там не содержится. Вот в чем проблема. Well, in this case, Mr. Magnitzki did not actually testify against the two officers we hear about.
Es sind Dinge, zu denen ich mich nicht verhalten kann. Wer der jetzt wann, zu welcher Zeit, welche Aussage als Zeuge oder nicht gemacht hat, das ist, kann ich nicht kommentieren, will ich auch nicht kommentieren. Und also da bin ich einfach nicht die Richtige, mich dazu zu fragen.
Okay, dann kann ich einfach diese Aussage, diese Hauptaussage hier lassen, weil das ist auch russisch, das ist auch ein Problem. Das ist die Aussage, die ich erwähnt habe. Da steht sogar nicht erstmal ihr Namen von diesem Karpov und Kuznetsov. Das heißt, es muss etwas falsch gegangen mit dieser Aussage, die eigentlich der Grund für die Verhaftung angeblich geworden ist.
Von Magnitzki?
Ja. Deswegen hat er...
Haben Sie mit Andi Groß geredet? Das ist derjenige, der Magnitzki-Bericht im Monat gemacht hat.
Ja.
Haben Sie den Bericht gelesen?
Ja.
Und wie geht er da das an?
Da gerade ist ein Problem. Er sagt, dass das an dem Tag, zitiert wahrscheinlich dieses Dokument, weil er sagt, an dem Tag, Magnitzki hat die Offiziere Karpov und Kuznetsov beschuldigt. Dieses Dokument sollte es sein, aber es gibt keine Beschuldigung.
Und das
Magnitzki
ist
hat nicht...
Von der Webseite von Bill Brown.
Ja.
Marie-Louise Beck referred me to the landmark Magnitsky report by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. I recalled Bill Browder had praised the report to me.
The Council of Europe, the special rapporteur, Andreas Gross, wrote a 50-page document. It's all in there. It's all in there. It's all in there.
L'ordre du jour appelle maintenant la présentation et la discussion du rapport de M. Andy Gross sur refuser l'impunité pour les meurtriers de Sergei Magnitsky.
Merci, Madame Präsidentin. Meine Damen und Herren, ich hatte das Privileg, zusammen mit Günther Schirmer eine Geschichte schreiben zu können, die unglaublich ist. Es ist die Geschichte eines Amerikaners, der Geld machte, der Geschäfte machte, der gute Geschäfte machte in wilden Zeiten, der wusste, wie man Gesetzeslücken, schlechte Gesetze ausnützte, der aber nicht Geschäfte machte und reich wurde, weil er stahl. Und es ist die Geschichte von 230 Millionen $, die eben gestohlen wurden.
What we actually came to you for is because you looked into it in great detail and investigated it. So
I tried with the help of Browder.
Because when Americans passed their sanctions, they didn't have an equivalent of your reports. Not really. So it's
Browder delivered them, must have delivered them some things, but they didn't investigate themselves.
Well, one day I looked at some documents. In one document of the 7th of October, it doesn't seem to accuse those officers. I know it's in Russian, unfortunately.
We always had to use the translations of the Browder office because I can't speak. I don't really understand Russian myself.
It can't be a coincidence. One says the 5th of June, and the other one is the 7th of October.
Yeah.
And that's what your timeline says. But they don't really accuse them.
They don't accuse them?
No.
Both don't accuse them. No, the documents we got, these kind of documents all come from Browder's sources.
because the Bill Browder's version is, or accepted version, is that because he accused them, they arrested him.
Yeah,
the same people.
Yeah, well.
So the question in my mind was that the fact that he was, you know, I don't know if you can say murder. Murder means an intentional killing, but he was certainly killed by this brutal...
They let him die. I agree totally that they didn't have the intention to kill him. And they didn't take care about him. Killing is not... Assassination is too much. Murdering is too much. In German you say fahrlässige Tötung, that you didn't take care enough.
Having tried to reach Bill Browder for months, I used the occasion of the launch of his book to try and talk to him. I knew most people here. I was one of them, the critics of the Russian government and Putin personally. It was lovely to see Marina Litvinenko again, the widow of Alexander, the whistleblower poisoned in London, whom I made a film about. Marina was one of many friends Bill Browder and I had in common.
Я занимаюсь фильмом Магнитским.
Я так поняла. Ты на работе на самом деле.
Ну, я как бы...
I really sympathized with and liked Sergei Magnitsky's mother, who introduced me to her daughter-in-law, Magnitsky's widow, Natalia. Many warm words were said about late Sergei, alert and cultured, not an ordinary accountant. When I called him a lawyer, though, a colleague of his corrected me.
I knew him very well, very well. He was brilliant. He was very smart.
A lawyer?
He was an accountant.
He was an accountant, okay.
As you all know, Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer in Russia, and he was murdered by the Russian state for exposing corruption. And when I try to explain to people what it felt like to have Sergei get killed, the closest thing I can compare it to is what it feels like when we watch these ISIS executions. Well, if you multiply that by 1 million, that's how I felt.
Bill, could you please sign the book? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I talked to Gross, and because you recommended me to go to him, because you were so busy. I was hoping you'd kind of talk me through it, but you were so extremely busy. I kept calling.
I know, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's all right. And I talked to him. We discussed, like for example, these documents, 7th of October and 5th of June, and there was no names, no accusation. I just wanted to make it clear before I finish the editing.
Right. It's bullshit.
If you just devote me a little bit of time.
I promise you. I promise you.
Editing is usually my favorite part of filmmaking. This time, it was disquieting. Not a natural-born detective, I felt I had no choice but to become one.
Well, if he didn't testify against these police officers,
Sometimes I think that this story was written like I wrote my script. It's a very good story. You investigate a crime, you discover the scam, you know who's the guilty one, you go to the police, report on them, and the guilty ones are so powerful that they find out about it immediately, and a month later arrest you and kill you in the prison. Sounds like a perfect plot, and that's what I was filming. But what do the documents tell us? Magnitzki wasn't the whistleblower. He is brought to the police, more or less, summoned to the police. Look, 7th of October.
This is the only testimony.
Well, there's this one and one before, which is the same, also witness.
Also does not mention the names.
Well, it does mention the names, but it doesn't accuse them. It just says there was this police raid, but at that point he doesn't even mention this theft.
Mm-hmm.
It just states that there was the police raid.
And that it was illegal, maybe, to confiscate.
Well, he doesn't say it was illegal. He just says, obviously, it's not nice when the office is raided, but you can see 5th of June. He doesn't mention this theft.
Uh-huh. Why would the police invite Magnitzki to testify?
Well, because they were investigating him and Mr. Browder and his companies for this crime, and Magnitzki didn't discover anything. That's what I found. Because he's supposed to have discovered it.
Okay.
But before other people did, it was even mentioned in the press. You know?
That 230.
Yeah. That's amazing. If you can scroll, I can show you. Look at this date, 7th of October. Magnitzki was questioned on the $230 million fraud. And look. In September, 2 weeks before Magnitzki's police questioning, a newspaper reported on that $230 million tax rebate fraud and the police probe into it. In another publication, a Moscow police officer described how his investigation into the fraud started following a crime report by a female citizen on the 9th of April 2008, 6 months before Magnitsky's October questioning. I didn't trust Russian investigators, but I found the citizen's name, Rima Starova, in other Russian sources. I found nothing about Starova in English, but then I tried Bill Browder's Hermitage website, but not the one you can click now, but the version dating back to the time of Starova's complaint, when Magnitsky was still alive, free and unknown. And bingo! There she was in the Hermitage press release, which corroborated basic facts in the Russian sources. April 2008, Ms. Starova filed a criminal complaint with the Russian Interior Ministry in Kazan, falsely accusing representatives of HSBC companies of the theft of state funds. Mr. Browder's companies were a part of the financial empire of HSBC, Europe's biggest bank. Who is this person who reported the crime first? Rima Starova became a figurehead director of Browder's companies after they were used to return $230 million in the tax rebate fraud. Hired to front the liquidation, Starova broke the rules of the game for some reason and reported the scam to the police. She accused these people. Hermitage, HSBCs, and Bill Browder's companies. This obscure lady reported the crime.
Добрый день. Я бы хотел заявить о преступлении.
Rima Starova must be a professional figurehead, a widespread job in Russia. But when she realized what sort of money had been stolen through the companies she inherited and what end some of her predecessors met, she must have just got scared.
Здравствуйте.
Добрый день.
Я пришла заявить о преступлении.
Hermitage at first kept the record of Starov's report of the tax rebate fraud as of a false accusation against them. The story of Magnitzki, the whistleblower, didn't yet exist, even if he was already in prison. Then in March 2009, the mention of Starov's report disappeared from the Hermitage website. Did it become a liability? Was a different story now going to be told? It is at the same time, at any rate, that Magnitzki started to be portrayed as an analyst, not yet a lawyer, who discovered the $230 million fraud. Thus, Magnitzki, the whistleblower story was born 9 months after his first alleged accusation of the police.
So only after somebody reported the crime, Mr. Browder, because he had to explain that, how come his companies are accused of this huge scam. He started saying that all this, it's not us. Yes, the theft took place because it was already in the open, but somebody else did it. The police did it. If you give the benefit of doubt to the Browder story, there's one fact, one hard fact, which you can quote to say that the Russian police, Karpov and Kuznetsov, did steal the $230 million. Mr. Browder and Andreas Gross, they claim that it is only possible to re-register the companies, to steal the companies, so to speak, to new owners, fake owners, if you have the original documents. Remember?
Yeah.
As in my film, in my script.
Yeah,
if you have original incorporation certificates, you know, in Russian, Ustav, Ustavные документы, la la la. And it is true that Mr. Karpov he doesn't deny that. He actually confiscated, he took them away, and he had them, those originals, in his possession. But anybody who knows Russia, anybody who works in Russia, knows it's very easy
to make copies of originals.
To make copies of originals, or to even make originals, or to make a legal copy, a copy which is good enough to re-register anything, to steal, if you want, anything. So you don't need to raid offices to get some documents, you know. And when I first heard, okay, the originals, but then I realized it's like a film script written about Russia. A film script about Russia written for the Western audience.
One thought that went through my mind, is it really a lie? Or if they innocently shortened the story to make it more poignant?
But who they?
Bill, the European Parliament, whoever made decisions relating to this case.
It's important for somebody who wants to get to the bottom of it, to understand why are people saying things which are not accurate. There must be a reason. Why?
I recall being torn between the political comfort zone of the official Magnitsky story and logic, pushing me into the uncertain and lonely future of an unwelcome investigation.
Hi. Sit over there, please. Maybe you can explain a few things and comment. During our filming, my young production designer downloaded documents because we wanted to have these authentic-looking papers in close-up and shots, and she downloaded those testimonies, which actually, to my shame, I hadn't. You know, I only read the little write-ups in English, and what can be said on the issue that the two documents we have, they seem to be like Sergei Magnitsky's answers to investigative questioning. And you write in the book that he set up a meeting. So he did set up a meeting, and he wasn't summoned by the investigators.
I don't remember who set up the meeting, but I think he was he was asked to go. I think we asked him, perhaps. I can't remember who asked him. So Sergei Magnitsky gave two testimonies, one in June of 2008 and one in October of 2008, before he was arrested, in which, in those testimonies, he named the police officers who were involved in the raid, which eventually led to the tax rebate fraud.
But on the 7th of October, I found no names.
But if you look at the testimony, the names were named in June, and he was reaffirming his testimony on the 8th of October.
On the 5th of June, it was not really known the tax fraud.
So he didn't name their names on the tax fraud, he named their names on the company theft, and then I think in July, I'd have to go back to our records.
Sure. But I'm trying to pin down who was the first one who mentioned the tax fraud first.
I'd have to go back to our records to figure out who was the first one, but we had a team approach towards the whole thing, so it could have been Sergei Magnitsky, it could have been any of our other lawyers, but that there was an ongoing investigation which led to the discovery of the tax rebate fraud.
Yeah. But it was a strange figure called Rima Starova, who in April 2008 went to the police in Kazan and basically reported a tax fraud. So her reporting a tax fraud was
part of a raider attack. She's one of the sort of low-paid, sort of I think some kind of pensioner who they paid some small amount of money to write some documents to sort of create some smokescreen about the.
Because the police, they started to investigate the tax fraud, and in July they started to question the tax officials and some of those straw men, fall men. It seems like Rima Stara was maybe at the beginning of that police investigation.
I don't think so. I don't know the details.
Yeah. So,
anybody who says that Sergei Magnitsky didn't expose a crime before he was arrested is just trying to whitewash the role of the Russian government.
And then the other question, the question of the original documents, because Andreas Gross wrote that the original documents were seized in the search of your offices and Feist and Duncan offices, and then were used for the re-registration. And he said also, I was told in London by Mr. Browder's office that it was only originals were, could be used to re-register companies.
So in order to re-register a company in Russia, it requires the original articles of association, the original registration, tax registration, and other original documents, and requires a notary to certify that you have those documents. Those documents were in the possession of Pavel Karpov from the Russian Interior Ministry.
But, there is a registry. One can, in Russia, there's a registry, anyone can go and get a copy of that articles of association or whatever it's called, Ustav, and then they can basically proceed, and they can find a notary who will stamp their application. But you're saying it wasn't.
What are you saying?
No, but
are you somehow saying that Pavel Karpov is innocent?
Well, I don't know, but
is that what you're saying?
No. But
it sounds like that's what you're saying.
No. I read in Sergei's testimony that
probably these are better questions for the lawyers to answer than for me as a non-lawyer. I'd be really careful about going out and trying to do a whole sort of thing about Sergei not being the whistleblower, because it's not going to do well for your credibility on this show.
Okay, well, but
it's just not true. So it's the Russian. This is sort of the subtle FSB version, and it's just this trying to cast aspersions where we don't have any men in Crimea, type of thing.
Okay.
Going down.
I wasn't exactly flattered by being accused of spreading the Russian government propaganda. I suddenly asked myself, am I doing the right thing politically? In questioning the Western Magnitsky story, am I not indeed siding with those in Russia who don't respect human rights? But could human rights be like a party ideology? And should I toe the line by not asking questions? In the end, something made me continue digging. I analyzed what Bill Browder had said at our last meeting. Bill Browder suddenly forgot who was the first one to denounce the crime he made Magnitzki famous for denouncing. Bill Browder could not deny the police had been investigating the crime long before Magnitzki allegedly reported it.
Are you somehow saying that Pavel Karpov is innocent?
Browder heard me well. I disagreed he had evidence against Karpov. The starting point of Browder's story was the police raid aiming at the seizure of paper documents of Browder's companies necessary, according to him, for their re-registration. Browder said that, and I just believed him because the rest of the story sounded true. But I now felt the need to look at the circumstances and documents I'd previously dismissed or ignored. The police search in June 2007 was a part of a tax evasion probe of one of the Browder's numerous shell companies. The company under investigation, Kamea, had sold $500 million worth of shares and took the profit out of the country, paying $50 million less than the legal amount of tax on it. The tax reduction scheme was thereby abused, according to the investigators. Already 3 years earlier, in 2004, an investigation in Browder's 2 other companies started. Browder was then accused of misusing tax exemptions and fabricating a letter from a government minister. I myself over-dramatized the raid in my film.
Stop! Excellent! Thank you!
I recalled Browder seemed to like the idea.
The reality was that they were not in masks at all. The reality is that they were all plain clothes. You know, you didn't even know that they were police officers, except for the fact that there was 25 of them, and they identified themselves as such.
Okay, all right.
But does that matter for you? And it's perfectly reasonable to dramatize it. I don't think anyone is going to argue.
In reality, not only did the search involve no machine gun-wielding commandos, a woman officer was in charge, and I found no evidence of violence Browder claimed had been used against his employees. There was no trace of a lawyer by name of Viktor Poryugin, allegedly beaten up during the raid, while his picture in Browder's presentation was that of an American human rights campaigner beaten up during a street protest in 1961.
Segregation must be stopped.
But Browder's biggest falsehood was the aim of the search.
And the basic objective of their search was to take away all of the stamps and seals and corporate documents that belonged to the 3 companies through which we had made all of our investments in Russia.
The reason I'd been taking Browder's raid story at its face value was that corporate raids were a household notion in Russia at the time. But I now realized that Browder's use of the corporate raid notion was all smoke and mirrors. Real raids were to physically force an owner to give up some physical property such as real estate or an industry. Getting hold of some articles of association by force made no sense as they gave no control over property. In the regulations valid at the time, I saw that no original documents were required for re-registration of companies. But the clincher was that the re-registration Browder was going on about, calling it theft, was just a formality, following some deal like a sale and purchase agreement. And only an owner could do it, either directly or entrusting someone by a power of attorney. Well, we know who the owner was. Maybe not formally, but de facto it was Mr. Browder. So why would he initiate the deal to get rid of the companies? And how exactly would he go about it? And so we looked for traces of the actual way Browder's companies had changed owners. The investigators questioned Magnitzki because he was the accountant for Browder's companies. The police would have known, of course, that company ownership was not changed by producing the documents Browder described for Western media.
So in order to re-register a company in Russia, it requires the original articles of association, the original registration, tax registration, and other original documents.
And it wasn't Magnitsky's story. Magnitsky did not claim what would make no sense to the cops. But what Magnitsky did mention did correspond to the actual way companies changed owners. Powers of attorney, something Browder never mentioned. Remember Gasanov, the mafioso middleman from our film? It was he who signed the contract leading to the infamous re-registration of Browder's Russian companies. The contract was done on behalf of Cyprus parent companies controlled by Browder and HSBC, on the basis of companies' powers of attorney issued to Gasanov. Defending himself and the Browder team, Magnitsky claimed the powers of attorney to Gasanov were not legitimate. But he said that only when questioned by the police, more than a year after the re-registration of the companies. While in Browder's story about the theft of his companies, there was no mention of his powers of attorney, fake or not. The issue of Browder's company's power of attorney to Gasanov did emerge almost 2 years later when Browder's lawyers were involved in lawsuits allegedly to recover the stolen companies. Hermitage tried to have its powers of attorney to Gasanov disqualified. Why? Because they had not been properly certified, apostilled. But Hermitage never claimed their powers of attorney had been forged. As a result, the court ruled against Browder, thus refusing to recognize that his companies had been stolen. If the powers of attorney were real, the Russian criminals must have acted with Browder's knowledge or in his interest. Is it possible that the very important William Browder would have anything to do with such unsavory characters? Is it surprising then that Mr. Browder always emphasizes the lowly nature of the Russians who formally took over his companies? But how far apart are those worlds in essence? People who are not in money business like me might think that companies that make billions have flashy offices in high-rises like these ones in Moscow. The 3 companies that were used for the $230 million fraudulent tax refund were domiciled in nondescript Moscow backyards, like this one here and here, and were not much more than mailboxes with authorized capital of some $400. Such shell companies are designed for real beneficiaries to remain anonymous, while in control of the chain of nominee owners and directors. A shell company is a formal tool, not a material value in itself. Its sale is just a change of nominee owners. With what purpose? In our case, the sale meant that the old nominee directors, clearly traceable to Bill Browder and HSBC, were not responsible for the theft of $230 million. The sale of the vehicles of the theft to some usual suspects shortly before the theft came handy. Gasanov, the middleman, who had the powers of attorney connecting the new nominees to the real beneficiaries, could not be asked who was giving him orders, as he mysteriously died once the transfer of ownership was completed. No proof that it was murder, but if that death was a coincidence, it wasn't the only one. A figurehead director of one of Browder's companies employed to steal the $230 million died within months following the theft. And so did the owner of a bank, to which a portion of the stolen money had been wired. From contracts signed by Gasanov, I knew of another figurehead involved in the scam. He seems to have survived, perhaps because he was arrested. Having served a term, he went into hiding. His name was Viktor Markelov. Questioned by the police, Markelov named Browder's associates Kharidinov and Kleiner as people involved in the company's re-registration. I saw the gentleman at Browder's London book launch party. Markelov also claimed having seen Gasanov with a man called Sergei Leonidovich. That's how a Russian would address Sergei Magnitsky. Magnitsky was questioned about his acquaintance with Gasanov. On the record, instead of simply denying that he knew Gasanov, Magnitsky refused to answer, citing his right to silence. So there was evidence that Magnitsky and other Browder's lieutenants had been involved in the re-registration they later called theft. Browder denied any involvement, but why would he invent a character called a brilliant young lawyer whom he'd hired specifically to investigate the theft of his companies?
I call you tomorrow, Bill.
We immediately went through our list of lawyers in Moscow and called up the smartest lawyer we knew, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky.
So according to Browder, Magnitsky was a brilliant young lawyer, and he was hired specifically to investigate the scam. Both not true, it turned out. Magnitsky was not a lawyer, and he had been an accountant for Browder's companies since the 90s, including the time when someone with intimate knowledge of the fund's accounting helped organize the $230 million tax refund. But there was in the Magnitsky Council of Europe report by Andreas Gross a statement that challenged claims that Browder and Magnitsky had acted suspiciously while their companies were used for the fraudulent tax refund. It is absurd that Messrs. Magnitsky and Browder themselves committed the fraud they had denounced in their detailed criminal complaints made before the fraud actually happened. Who would be able to know about a fraud before it happened? A clairvoyant or an accomplice? But of course, Mr. Gross could have meant that Browder's people had spotted someone preparing a fraud. In the report's timeline, I read this. December the 3rd and the 6th, 2007, detailed criminal complaints by Hermitage with Mr. Magnitsky's collaboration about company theft. The 3rd and the 6th of December is about 3 weeks before the $230 million refund was paid out. I found the document the Parliamentary Assembly's report referred to, but I found no trace of Magnitsky's collaboration there. The document was signed by Browder's lawyer, Eduard Kharidinov. I caught up with Eduard Kharidinov and wanted to interview him, but he declined. But I did recall having talked to him at Bill Browder's book launch party. Curiously, Browder introduced Kharidinov as a would-be Magnitsky.
They were the other lawyers who could have been Sergei Magnitsky. We have Eduard Kharidinov over here.
I understood talking to Kharidinov, Browder probably meant Kharidinov too was a bit of a whistleblower.
Когда же это хищение произошло, этих огромных денег, я же за 3 недели подал жалобу на имя генерального прокурора, был на личном приеме, подавал это все, требовал. Ребята, ищите, доказывайте, мы вам показываем. По сути дела, было наше алиби того, что мы к этому не причастны.
An alibi? Was it a slip of a tongue? If he warned prosecutors 3 weeks before a crime, the $230 million tax refund that is, it should have given the police enough time to stop the refund. But was it 3 weeks? And what was the complaint exactly about? On filing of a complaint, an official acknowledgement card is issued. The card Browder presented in one of his press releases as an evidence the complaint had been made looks extremely strange. The date had been clearly tampered with, and the card contains a colloquial, media-friendly description of the crime, a rate seizure that would have not been used on such an official document simply because such definition did not exist under law. But even in the complaint itself, I found no claim the companies had been stolen. Browder's lawyer, Kharidinov, complained about an attempted theft of some $400 million. Yet Mr. Browder had told me those companies had no assets at the time.
At the time this happened in 2007, we didn't have any assets left in Russia.
Browder's lawyers did make another attempt, as it were, to report a crime, now 11 days before the big theft. But it too was unsound. It contained no information about the companies in question and not even the address of the plaintiff. And this report too was not about the theft of companies. In the English text, it was about the theft of assets, which we know didn't exist. But the Russian version on the same page clearly avoids saying theft, but merely mentions actions aiming at a theft. Bill Browder's words and his documents didn't match. But how many people could I impress with such details? When Browder's image and discourse of an anti-Putin campaigner seemed so unassailable. It is at that point that an interesting video caught my attention.
Okay, Nicholas Casal, right? Allow me to show you your credentials.
Someone wants something from Bill? A lawyer is serving Browder with a subpoena, but he is running away. I realized that there were other people out there in America who had a bone to pick with Mr. Browder. In New York, Browder claimed the companies owned by a Russian businessman had benefited from the infamous $230 million tax fraud. Unexpectedly for Browder, the Russians' lawyers insisted Browder testify under oath about the Magnitsky affair. After avoiding the court for a year, Browder was ordered to testify.
This is the tape number 1 of the videotape deposition of William Browder. Will the court reporter please swear the witness in?
Do you swear the testimony? Do you swear the testimony about to be the truth, the whole truth, and put the truth up again?
I do.
Thank you.
HSBC Guernsey Trust owned Glendora and Cohn, the Cyprus companies. Correct. Which then owned the Russian companies. Correct. All right. And at the time of the $230 million fraud, they had no stock in them. Who had no stock? Parfinian, Ryland, and McComb.
Correct.
They had no assets. Correct?
No.
Was there money removed from the bank accounts?
I'm not sure.
And yet, it was precisely the theft of assets that Hermitage reported. This is what I call high finance. Someone steals or tries to steal $400 million from you, and you're not sure whether they succeeded or not. This company stolen is a very striking concept. To represent it as a theft, it's a very clear, striking idea which everybody understands. Theft taken away. And company theft. Let's talk about a car theft. It's much clearer. What does a theft mean? The moment it's stolen, you're not responsible for it. Whatever happens to it, whoever this car hits, it's not your fault. The car was used for a huge robbery, $230 million. But it's nothing to do with us.
It was stolen?
It was stolen. It had been stolen before.
Yeah.
The problem with Browder's story is that even if we believe it was stolen, they didn't let the authorities know. They didn't complain. They didn't call the police, so to speak. My car was stolen, I called the police. But they put in a very confusing letter about an attempt to steal money from them, the money which wasn't there. So it was like calling the police and say, instead of my car is stolen, say, we suspect that the car was driven to an empty house to load some things which didn't exist.
But it opens Browder to lots of people looking at him very closely.
Well, it's public relations campaigns. It's only helpful. It's a proof that they couldn't be blamed, that Browder couldn't be blamed. We warned them. We complained. It's absurd to blame us. So it uses this kind of ordinary guy logic, and the politicians, it seems, operate on ordinary guy logic, and think stealing at 230 million is just like, a pickpocket snatches a wallet out of your pocket and disappears in the crowd. In that case, he doesn't need to pickpocket, doesn't need to write complaints or have political human rights campaigns over the case. Ever since the 1970s movie All the President's Men, the catchphrase "follow the money" represents the best investigative logic. Given Bill Browder's inability to prove he was not in control of his shell companies, which had been used to steal the money, it seemed it was essential for him to show that the money ended up with some usual suspects, the Russians. The lawyers for the Russian businessman Browder named as a beneficiary of the Magnitsky fraud subpoenaed a Homeland Security agent. He was in charge of the money tracing in the Magnitsky case.
Are you the person who investigated this case for the United States?
Yes, I am.
And what did the investigators for the United States do in connection with investigating this case?
In general, we interviewed witnesses, we reviewed documents obtained from the witnesses.
What witnesses did you interview?
We interviewed William Browder. We've interviewed and other associates with William Browder.
Do you know what a witness is?
Yes.
Did you interview any direct, competent witnesses?
No, I did not.
Did you interview any witnesses other than those from Hermitage?
No, I did not.
Your first investigative step was you found Mr. Browder to be credible?
Yes.
What steps did you take in finding Mr. Browder to be credible?
Well, we reviewed his documentation. We reviewed some of his statements and verified some of his statements via the internet.
What did he tell you?
Well, he told us the story of Sergei Magnitsky.
What public source documents did he refer you to?
He referred me, on his website, he referred me to a Russian language newspaper.
What else?
And the documents that he provided.
What documents did he provide?
Copies of the bank records, copies of wire transactions.
Did you get in touch with the banks to see if they were accurate?
No, I did not.
And you obtained flow charts, is that correct?
That's correct.
And those were also from Hermitage that you obtained them?
Correct.
So every transfer is based on copies that are not authenticated, of records that are incomplete, based on an accounting assumption. Is that right?
That would be correct.
What is this document?
I don't know.
You have no idea?
No.
You gave it to the U.S. Attorney?
Yes.
Did you explain it to the U.S. Attorney?
No.
What'd you tell the U.S. Attorney about this document?
Nothing.
Just delivered the letter and told them nothing?
Correct.
And you have no idea who created this document?
No.
Now, these documents supposedly trace money from the Russian treasury into various accounts. You know that, right?
Yep.
You don't know how the tracing was done?
No.
So you have no idea how the money was traced?
I have a vague idea, but not a detailed idea.
All right, so what's your vague idea?
That the team gathered information from various sources and were able to connect the dots to trace the money.
Connect the dots. Well, who specifically connected the dots?
Various lawyers, various investigative reporters.
They connect the dots for you? Reporters connected these dots?
In some cases, reporters connected some dots.
So what reporters did you rely upon to connect the dots?
Bill Alpert at Barron's in New York.
Anybody else?
Roman Anin at Novaya Gazeta. I shouldn't say I relied on them. They worked with our team.
Anybody else?
The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project.
Can you explain to us how you would trace and know that it was the Russian treasury money and not some unassociated, as far as we know, clean money? Do you have an explanation?
I didn't do the tracing.
But you've been the one going around writing books, touting it, so you have no explanation. Yes or no? You have an explanation or you don't?
I didn't do the tracing.
Do you have an explanation or not?
Do I have an explanation? This is not my area of expertise.
I'm asking you whether you have any explanation from anybody.
I don't have an explanation.
So Browder cannot explain the difference between the money from the fraud and funds of unrelated origin, even if he was relied upon as a source of the United States Homeland Security. But I kept hearing from journalists that Browder and his team had found the stolen money, while it was the other way around when he was under oath. Journalists connected some dots for him. I looked up publications of those who connected the dots for Browder, OCCRP and Novaya Gazeta. Written in shaky English, the investigation is first of all a wholesale adoption of Browder's tale. Then it was something Russian police had presumably been unable or unwilling to do, an attempt at money tracing. Yet when I clicked on a source of the money tracing from the infamous fraud, I was surprised. The information came from what we were told did not exist, a Russian investigation into the tax fraud and its proceeds by a Russian police detective, Oleg Urzhomtsev. Ironically, the investigator, Oleg Urzhomtsev, whose work had been used to support the whistleblower narrative, was blacklisted by the American Magnitsky Act. So there seemed to be a pattern. Use a Russian investigation to prove the Russians have stolen the money. But was that really proven? The Crime Reporting Project publication seemed to have reprocessed the Russian investigation into a storyline and a chart easily digestible for the public. The chart pointed out a few companies and banks, while the Russian investigation files named dozens of those that had laundered the treasury fraud. A selection had found its way into the red chart, but why only these companies had been chosen was not clear. And at a closer look, the figures simply didn't add up. The alleged beneficiary of the fraud, Prevezon, received about $850,000. Red arrows tell us the source of the money is the theft from the treasury. We know it was $230 million. But here, only $74 million leave the infamous scam companies. And then, somewhere in the middle, $300 million is accumulated, most of it from unrelated sources. So what allows reporters to peddle these woolly maths as the evidence someone benefited from the Magnitsky affair? When the news of my film being completed spread, Süddeutsche Zeitung, known for the Panama Papers publication, published another sensation. Money from the fraud discovered by Magnitsky ended up in the pockets of Putin's friend, the cellist Roldugin. I looked into it The source was OCCRP, the collaborators of Mr. Browder, his Magnitsky tale unquestioned. This time, even the simple dates made no sense. The transactions that were supposed to link the fraud to Putin's friend took place in July and October 2007, that is before the fraud at the end of December. I'm often asked, if you think you're such a smart ass, proving the establishment wrong and stuff, why don't you tell us where the money's gone? My answer is this. The problem, or tragedy perhaps, is that the international financial system embraces corporate anonymity and the imitation of business, allowing stolen money to go untraceable like trickles in a stream. Those who stole it know where it is. Some of their helpers knew enough to have died under suspicious circumstances. Having to become an investigator didn't kill a human in me. I was regularly overcome by deep unease. Was I defending a system that killed Magnitsky, even if I'd found no proof he'd been murdered? Yet, does it not matter that someone with a motive to divert attention from a white-collar crime was actively using compassion for a cover-up? And as disgusting as Russian prisons might be, I had a duty to keep to strict definitions, that of torture in particular. There is no evidence that Magnitsky was tortured. In a summary describing his imprisonment put together in the 10th month of his detention, Magnitsky does not claim he was generally treated more harshly than other inmates. It is clear, for example, that the episode with the broken windows was in September, not in December, as Mr. Browder tells us. It involved other inmates and wasn't deliberate. Magnitsky writes that the doctors treated him adequately until the 26th of July 2009, that is for the first 8 months of his detention. Then, after the transfer to another prison, Magnitsky does report medical neglect. But of these last 4 months, Magnitsky spent more than a month in a medical facility, which is not mentioned in the official Browder story of Magnitsky's ordeal. The inconsistency in Browder's statements that stunned me most before finishing the film was his translation of the Russian post-mortem examination of Magnitsky. Whole sections were rewritten in the translation, for example, the circumstances of the case. And then I saw that Browder's translator apparently could not make something out in the post-mortem report. Something was illegible. Well, I thought, with a bit of luck, maybe I could decipher it. The words were printed black and white in Times New Roman as clearly as anywhere else. No traces of damage were found on the scalp. Is it illegible or disastrous for a story in which Magnitsky had suffered a head injury before death? Is the whole murder story just a patchwork of quotes from Russian documents out of their context? But the man did die in that jail.
Nobody deserves to die like this, you know, whether he was guilty of some tax evasion, even if he's not the victim of these, as Browder says, corrupt cops. You know, the guy is a victim.
Did anybody coordinate on your behalf with Firestone Duncan about the defense of Mr. Magnitsky?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't remember.
You were being criminally prosecuted along with Mr. Magnitsky at that time. You didn't pay attention?
I don't know. I don't remember.
Did you ever have somebody suggest to Mr. Magnitsky that he should take responsibility for the tax returns?
I don't remember.
So whose victim was Sergei Magnitsky? Those who made him into a victim of the Russian corrupt state did not even mention his arrest to anybody when it happened. Why? Because the whole story was invented much later. A murdered hero as an alibi for living suspects. So do we allow graft and greed to hide behind a political sermon? Will democracy survive if human rights, its moral high ground, is used to protect selfish interests?
Sergei Magnitsky was an ordinary man, but he became an extraordinary champion of justice, fairness, and the rule of law in Russia.
Magnitsky war ein Whistleblower, ein Mann, der an sein Land glaubte.